Hello, I'm Alan. This time our Bible reading is taken from the book of Ruth. It's a very short book that can be read in 10 minutes, and I'm just starting with the first 18 verses. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judea went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judea. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And when they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons or her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered consideration for his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus, and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Now, you may know how the story continues. Naomi and Ruth return to the land of Judah. Ruth receives kindness from Boaz, a relative of Naomi. They marry and have a son who is the grandfather of King David, and they all live happily ever after. It just seems like a nice story about human struggles, God's provision for widows, and the welcoming and care of foreigners. In our Bibles, the book of Ruth is tucked away after the book of Judges, and it implies that it is a historical record from the 11th century BC, before the Common Era. In the Hebrew scriptures, however, it's grouped with the writings, those books written in the 5th century BCE, after the return from exile in Babylon. The list of scrolls included in the Law and Prophets had already been decided as sacred, so could not be added to. It would be like us adding the writings of Mother Julian of Norwich into our New Testament. Like the books of Esther and Jonah, Ruth is a historical fiction set in an earlier time than that in which it was written. And this assertion is supported by the type of Hebrew language being used and the reference to King David, who came some centuries after the Judges. Another clue is the fictitious or allegorical nature of the names of the two sons. Mahlon means sickness and Chilion means wasting. So why do we have a 5th or 4th century BCE story about events 800 years earlier? Why was it written, and what does it mean for us today? Now, Jesus said that we are to love God with all our hearts and all our minds, and to love our neighbour as ourselves. And now, since both commandments are put together as the whole obligation on us, then it must be possible to do both at the same time. The Bible is full of examples where this didn't happen, and the stories of Ruth, Jonah and Job were written to counter the exclusive laws found in those other 5th century writings, Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. Those books record how membership of Israel was restricted to the descendants of those that had been captive in Babylon and those willing to submit to the law of Moses. This means we cannot take the Bible at face value. It has contradictions and includes customs from different cultures and schools of thought. How we use the Bible as a guide to life matters and has consequences. Let me give you an example. In Montreal, Canada in 1885, a smallpox epidemic occurred in the city. Smallpox was the first disease to be prevented by inoculation. And if you were born before 1971, you will have your vaccination passport, a circular scar on your arm about the size of a 10p. Like now, there were anti-vaxxers from the beginning, mostly using theology to back up their reasoning. The Reverend Edward Massey in England preached a sermon blaming the distemper experienced by Job in the Bible upon an inoculation by Satan. Other clergy preached that the technique was being promoted by evil sorcerers and atheists. Smallpox was regarded as a judgment of God on the sins of the people, and to avert it is but to provoke God more. Or that inoculation was an encroachment on the prerogatives of Jehovah, whose right it is to wound and to smite. So by preventing the spread of disease, they were bidding defiance to heaven itself, even to the will of God. In 1885, that serious smallpox epidemic broke out in Montreal in Canada. Few Protestants died because they had been mostly vaccinated. However, the Roman Catholic clergy were generally opposed to the practice, and their parishioners died needlessly, in great numbers, accounting for 90% of the deaths. So what you believe does matter. How you interpret the events and circumstances has consequences. So let's go back to the 5th century BCE and the returning exiles from captivity in Babylon. They concluded that they had been invaded and taken into captivity because it was God's punishment for their tolerating the worship of idols and failure to follow the law of Moses exactly. And they resolved to clean up their act and ensure proper worship only at the temple in Jerusalem, and to keep the nation pure, that is, to have no intermingling of blood with people from the nations round about. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we read, "After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, the people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighbouring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them, and the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness." So those people opened their scriptures to get an answer. And we read on. "On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, And there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. And when the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. This was a harsh edict. The women, the wives, the Moabite wives, the Ammonite wives, as they had married whilst in captivity, suddenly became non-persons, destitute and aliens, sent away without their children. And then along comes the story of Ruth from Moab. Moab can be thought of being located in the area which is now modern Jordan. And Moabites were descended from Lot's sons, conceived through incest. So there's a great deal of antagonism between the Moabites and the incoming Hebrews from their wanderings in the wilderness. And this hostile attitude led to the Hebrews excluding Moabites from the congregation up until the 10th generation. In our story of Ruth, though, Ruth, a detested foreigner, is welcomed, included, and contributes to the well-being of the nation through her descendant David. It's like an ancient "who do you think you are?" You thought you were racially pure, and your hero kings and David and Solomon are your ideals, but they were part Moabite. Take that. The story of Ruth, and also Job, was a subversive counterbalance to the belief that blessings came from following the law and ensuring racial purity. That bad things happen were punishments from God. You must have done something wrong. Those ancient peoples thought calamity had come upon them because of their sin to regain God's favour, and implemented extreme legislation against marriages with foreigners and about temple worship. It would be like Belgium thinking they'd been invaded by the Germans because they allowed jazz music and sexy dancing. They'd drawn the wrong conclusion because they were mistaken in their beliefs. As Jesus remarked about the 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, he said, "Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the other living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you." Coming to the 21st century, what are we to make of it? Well, I would say these things. Firstly, the Bible is not an encyclopedia of answers from God. We don't need to have a word from the Lord or rely on ancient texts to regulate our lives. Secondly, God seems to be more about inclusion than exclusion. There are no foreigners. God does not have favourites, and that those with much are obliged to care for those in need, including migrants fleeing from starvation, war, or persecution. And thirdly, we have to work out what loving our neighbour means in our street, our community, our nation, our world. And fourth, we need to be careful when we use Scripture as the only source of authority on any moral or social issue. Since the Scriptures are fixed for all time, the beliefs are often considered equally unchangeable. Now, the historical record shows that change does occur and that religious groups use various methods to modify their beliefs. Sometimes the texts which support the old beliefs are simply ignored or reinterpreted, or are regarded as having been valid at the time and or the society in which they were written, but are not guidance for people today. A more recent example. In the 1960s, many people of different Christian denominations believed that racial integration was against God's law because it led to the mixing of seed. Or, going back a bit further, in 1846, James Simpson, the Scottish physician, promoted the use of chloroform to relieve pain during childbirth, and this was immediately opposed by the church, citing Genesis 3:16, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." The avoidance of pain was seen as thwarting God's will. Fortunately, Simpson found a competing passage from Genesis 2:21, which describes the first surgical operation. It seems to support the use of anaesthetic. He used this quote, "God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. He took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh." In time, the church's opposition dissipated, and painkillers have since lost their religious significance. We need to remember, Jesus said that he came that we might have life in all its fullness. Yes, in the hereafter, but the kingdom is to come here by our practicing those two great commandments. Love God, love your neighbour. And God works with those who work with him or her, those who practice love, justice and mercy. It is our practice that witnesses to Jesus and the gospel, not our words. I hope that's helpful.